Greek comments that Jesus spoke. And here's the interesting thing. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. So someone translated his Aramaic into Greek, and then these three Gospels quote him the same way. So if it were different people translating his Aramaic into different Greek, you would probably get some differences. But since they're all translating his Greek the same way, you end up with the assumption that they had a common oral tradition, or maybe even a text that we don't have anymore, that was lost, that they were all based on. But John, and by the way, the Gospel of Luke is also considered to be just part one of a two-part story, because the Acts of the Apostles is also written by Luke. And so that story, that romantic story, really, that is interesting for other people to read, is supposed to start with John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and it goes all the way to at the end of the Acts of the Apostles to Paul dying. Well, actually, it ends before he dies in Rome, where he is eventually executed by the Romans, but it ends with him almost kind of having good friends among the guards and everything, and teaching them about Jesus and so on. So it's kind of a complete story. And that Luke was also considered to be the partner or the friend of Paul. So the Luke Gospel is considered to be the Paul bias view of the story. By the way, that also explains how Paul, in teaching the gospel to the Gentiles, concludes that you don't have to become Jewish in order to be a Christian. And there was a fight, really, between him and the so-called Pillars of Jerusalem. Pillars, who were those? Peter, probably, and others of the original apostles. And the trouble was, if you're an adult male, you don't want to have a circumcision operation. It's quite significant. Abraham apparently had his circumcision when he was 99 years old.
I don't think the baby really wants a circumcision operation either. This can't really
I'm not going to get into it because I'm not going to get into it. Even though I contemplated bringing an USIC to class, I'm not going to get into that. So anyway, John is very different because it's very abstract. John, by the time we get to John talks about Jesus as saving us from sin, and instead of focusing on the sayings, it's instead a focus on what eventually becomes kind of the abstract view of what Christianity means to us. So it's a much more abstract. It starts off by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Somebody remember? I like in the beginning was the Word, and then I don't remember the rest. But we can do that. But so it's very abstract, very philosophical. It's considered very philosophical. And even though it has the basic outline of the story that the Synopticon does, it's very different because it's looking at it from a very philosophical point of view. And you end up with this interesting relationship between Jerusalem and Athens. And lots of folks to talk about that. What's the connection between Jerusalem and Athens? And of course, Athens is, the Greek philosophers. So what's the Greek philosophy got to do with Jewish scripture, basically, right? And Jesus, of course, was Jewish, and so this is, all a part of a Jewish narrative. And yet at the same time, what happens when you get into people like St. Augustine, and we'll be talking about next class. You're taking the Greek philosophers and using that to read the Christian scripture, which includes, of course, the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, right? And you're trying to look at that and try to figure out, okay, so how can we interpret all of this in light of what we believe is the case about the way the universe, the cosmos, is structured, right? And St. Augustine is a Platonist. So when we talked about the post-Aristotelians, and I left off by talking about Plotinus and the idea that there was plenty of Neoplatonism around. Augustine is going to be a Neoplatonist. So he's going to believe basically in the way Plato structured his view, that there's the world of ideas. Well, that becomes heaven, basically, right? And the world of matter, which is corrupt, and you can't really know things, and you really, your soul really wants to escape from this because it's really hellacious, but at the same time, Plato gives the story about, the cow, if the farmer who depends on the cow came out one morning and the cow was just lying there dead because it quit, the farmer would not be very happy. And neither would God be very happy if you quit, because the reason you're here is because God has a plan for you. That's part of Aristotle too. Is everything has a purpose. The reason you're here. God has a plan for you. You wouldn't be here otherwise. Might feel like everything's miserable now, but maybe by the time you're old enough to be Dumbledore and you have 12 tribes of children that are inheriting all the earth, you never know, right? That's what happened to Abraham, right? When Abraham, sees the Elohim come, which is very confusing because that's plural, but it's also God, and he offers to give them a meal, and so he feeds them, and they get happy. In fact, it seems like they were drinking something, because they're all really happy. And at some point, the Elohim promised Abraham all of this land will be, his and his heirs. And Sarai, who's in the tent, laughs at God because she's postmenopausal. So she's like, "Ha, you old, whatever." But Abraham took that, to be. I think we already talked about Abraham. So.
Were they displeased that she laughed? Was she in trouble?
No. She's famous though for laughing at God. A bunch of old stupid codgers. But it turned out that Abraham did have children. Remember, she initially offered Hagar because she was postmenopausal, so she gave Hagar. Hagar becomes pregnant, and that's Ishmael, who's the ancestor then of all the Arab tribes. But then she does become pregnant, and that's Isaac. Isaac has Esau and Jacob, is that right? Am I remembering? Jacob becomes Israel, as the 12 tribes of Israel. Neat stories, neat family tree. So never give up, I suppose. So where am I then? So let me show you the complexity of this issue. The early church fathers. It's a website. Go to the writings. Yes, this is the right one. We'll go to this one. I think they're actually, it's both the same. Okay. So what are we looking at here? I'll make this a little bigger. Okay, so on this website, which please visit it and just look around at different places because it'll give you a good idea of just how complex all this stuff is. But so the ante-Nicene fathers are referred to as the ones before Nicene, because a significant point in 325 is the Nicene Council. I'll show you that. All kinds of interesting. Okay, Wikipedia. Yay! I like Wikipedia. So the council is called, and that's why there's a break. All the fathers before the council, and then you'll see there's of course all the ones after the council. But the council was called because already Christian groups were fighting one another. They weren't just arguing with one another. They were getting to the point where they were actually using weapons and stuff. And so the emperor at the time, who was famous, Constantine the Great, calls a council to meet. And all of the people that are important to the various groups all are supposed to come. And they do. And at this council, he basically orders them to come to a consensus about what is it that Christians ought to believe, and what books are important, and all that kind of thing. And they actually, after quite a rousing meeting, came to conclude that there were, a divine nature of God the Son and his relationship to the Father. By the way, that's kind of famous because the argument was between one group that said Jesus was homoousios, which in Greek means he was one ousios, one substance with the Father, and the other group argued that he was homoiousios, which is an iota, e, in the middle of the homoousios, and so that one iota of difference was actually pretty significant. Because it meant that Jesus was God as well, but there was actually a separate nature to Jesus, and that was the Arius point of view. Arius was the father that was primarily supporting that point of view. It's also referred to as Gnosticism. They believed that they had a special quality that was transmitted from hand to hand. In the Gnostic tradition. The other point of view that argued that Jesus was one substance with the Father was the followers of Athanasius. And even though the council settled this and said Athanasius is correct, it doesn't actually go away. You still end up with these different groups that are arguing. In fact, we see this even in like the 400s, 500s. The Emperor Theodosius, for example, is a follower of Arius, and yet he's the emperor of Rome, and in conflict with the teacher of St. Augustine, who is Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose, and Bishop Ambrose is a follower of Athanasius, right? So you have a conflict, right there, literally causes the Roman emperor to call his guards to attack all the people at the cathedral, and Ambrose with all the people, and Augustine's mother is in the crowd, actually, and the Roman guards decide not to kill all the people, but they yield to Ambrose, so Ambrose wins, basically, in that one particular conflict. And Augustine was there. Of course, very worried about his mother, but the trouble he had at the time was he was the rhetor, the speaker, the one that every day would go on the news on TV and say what the emperor was doing, kind of. He was the speaker for the emperor. That's, by the way, a fascinating story that's in a book called The Source of Life, and it's all about Augustine's conversion. Shoot. Did I said the source. It's